Good morning, Wake Up HCC. We are live and with one really special show is the best word I think that I can use to describe the show today. And I'm gonna be very vulnerable. I'm gonna be very honest, and I hope that you guys really appreciate that and really bear with me and are gentle really, because this is the conversation that we're having today is a conversation that um and I looked up some quotes today, and that's where I want to start today with Rosa Parks. And she said, to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. It says, we will fail when we fail to try. And with the whole social justice and everything that we've been seeing and everything that we have been exposed to through media in just the last few weeks, I have to be honest, I have been afraid of saying something because I'm afraid that I'm going to be misunderstood. I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid that if I start that conversation, somebody's going to read my words in a way that's just not who I am and it's not what I feel. And so I've been very quiet. I have been very quiet. I've been observing and, just kind of like sitting back, having my own thoughts, my own opinions, hurting quite a bit for everything that's happening, and just simply not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say, and not knowing where I fall into all of this as a Latina who immigrated into this country, I don't about 20 years ago, and whose lens, as this beautiful word was brought up in conversation yesterday to me, the lens that I bring is a very different lens than everybody else has. And we all have our own lens. And I think that that's one of the beauties and the challenges in this conversation, is to understand that we all have our own lens and that we need to do our part to expand our lens, to appreciate everybody else's lens, everybody else's position on this, and to come to a place where we can all feel safe, respected, and valued. So Juli from Inquiring Minds and our host from our podcast, Healthy Minds, and I had a conversation about 3 weeks ago, and I said, I really want to talk about this, but I feel really unprepared, and we had this conversation, and we came up with this idea of taking the first step, like Rosa Parks said, and that's what we're doing today. We're taking that first step and diving into this conversation of racism, of social justice and change, and we're going at it with a perspective of mental health. We're really putting the forefront in mental health and making sure that everybody feels safe, and in this conversation that we're taking care of ourselves, and at the same time that we're trying to understand everything that's being presented. So Juli, thank you so much for opening the door. Thank you so much for taking this opportunity to really have these conversations, to really bring this out to our viewers, to our listeners here at Dragon Digital Radio, and for creating this series that I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about. So welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you for the platform, of course, and your willingness to kind of throw our our schedule out the window and come up with something that really just we needed to talk about in a way that would be authentic, like you said, and also from a place of learning. So our series is called Black Mental Health Matters, but we're wedging a whole lot under that umbrella. So we're starting with 5 episodes in this series, and it will be launched on Tuesdays throughout July. You can find recorded videos kind of like this Facebook Live on the Dragon Digital Radio Facebook page on Tuesdays again, or on the Healthy Minds Podcast Podbean page. We are basically doing a lot of listening and some gentle questioning, and we have some really excellent special guests joining us, which I'm very excited about. And some of the topics we're talking about so far are environmental racism, redlining, racial battle fatigue, professionalism, the importance of diversity and inclusion, and how it's not enough to just say you're diverse, care discrimination, the history of racial trauma, intergenerational impacts, and then internalized racism's impact on the body and mind. And then today we are launching our series with a super special guest. I'm very excited to introduce you to her in just a moment, who's going to be giving us basically the foundation to understand the rest of our conversation. So we're starting with a broad overview of information about racism and some of those social psychology terms that if you haven't taken Psych 101 or social psych, you may want this explanation. And then we get a little bit deeper into some of these definitions as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you really quickly to Dr. Kellie McCants-Price. If you would like to just quickly tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
So Juli and Cris, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to join this conversation. So I am a wife, I am a mom, I am an African-American woman. You know, I'm unapologetically Black. And have lived, you know, the Black experience, the Black female experience for my entire life. I am a psychology professor at Anne Arundel Community College. I've also worked as an adjunct professor at a couple of other institutions. And I do, in addition to teaching, I also do some diversity, equity, and inclusion work for the college and some other DEI work for the community. Is that enough?
You know, I love that you started by saying, I am a mom, you know, and I am a woman, and then you went and said, I'm an unapologetically Black woman. I love that you said that, because we are all a composition of so many things, you know, and I think the conversation right now is on the racism, right? We're looking at one of those aspects, and we're leaving everything else behind. And that's where I think I want to start this conversation. I want to start this conversation by really understanding the underlinings of racism, what it really is. I've already heard from two great guests from two podcasts that we've already recorded with Juli that are coming up. And it continues to just blow my mind, because I've shared with Juli, racism to me, the lens where I come from and where my experience with it throughout my life is that it was something that was in history books and was in the past. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in Ecuador, and I, you know, maybe I was just that naive. Maybe, you know, I did not experience it. I did not see it. It was something that to me was a thing from the past that just ended years and years ago. And to have it here now, it's and to hear the experiences from, you know, from people like our guests that we've had, or maybe from your personal experience, that you've had to live with this your entire life, to me is just mind-boggling. Is like, how are we there still? You know, why are we still there? So let's open that up and start there, if you don't mind.
So Cris, it's interesting. I was born in the 1970s, and according to the history books, we should have been past that, right? So it was after civil rights, it was after emancipation, you know, so I mean, people weren't enslaved anymore. So by the time I was born, I should have been born into this, like, you know, this awesome colorblind utopia, and I wasn't. So trying to think of where to start. So racism in the United States, I'll just go all the way back to 1619 and say it started the first time that enslaved Africans were brought here from, you know, typically from West Africa. And I think a lot of times when we hear about enslaved people, we think, oh, 1865, that was over. Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, all that was done. But what has happened is instead of like enslaving people in a sort of overt way, like I own this person, I have power over them, I can control X, Y, and Z. I tell them when to work, when to get up, where they can worship, if they can worship, whether they can read, whether they can write. What's happening now is more covert stuff. And so now you can't say, or Juli maybe couldn't say as a white woman, I could own Kellie, but there might be policies and procedures and things like that that don't specifically say Black people, but may, well, I was going to say unintentionally, but no, it's kind of crafted that way. but maybe set up in a way that those policies and those rules and procedures disproportionately affect Black people. And so I think it's very easy for us to look and say, well, I mean, you had civil rights. We had a Black president. Things are so much better now. But I'll tell you, I mean, even in the shortly under 50 years that I've been on this earth, I've experienced racism. And I think sometimes people are blown away when I tell them stories like, I went into a liquor store and I was well over 21 to buy a pack of beer for my husband. And I gave them my debit card, and it was in a community where I work. I gave them my debit card, and I was asked to recite the name on the debit card.
Wow.
White friends of mine have been in that same liquor store. Never happened to them.
Wow.
And so I had to wonder, you know, it was the type of beer I bought. Because I think sometimes when it happens to you, you think, well, what's going on here? Like, this is kind of weird. But just in checking in with some folks, I had a few people tell me, no, you're seeing what you're seeing. I've been in situations where I have an African American female colleague who was hired at the same time that I was. You know, we're good friends, we're contemporaries, we do a lot of work together, but we're not the same person and we look very different. But I cannot tell you how many times people look at me and tell me, I know you were in that meeting 5 days ago. I'm like, I was in class. No, I saw you there. No, you did not. And I sometimes start to wonder, am I having a body snatcher type experience because like they think they saw me, but they really didn't. When in all actuality, they saw my African American female colleague. I mean, we've had our names mixed up. I've been accused of submitting paperwork that that came from another African American woman. I mean, this is still lingering and still existing. And I've talked a little bit about my own personal experience, and I think sometimes we think racism is a very personal thing. So if I personally am not saying the N-word, doing offensive things, if I am personally kind to people of color, then I am not racist. But I might be doing things that are complicit with racism at a systemic or more institutional level.
And thank you for saying that, because I think that's the part where at first I wasn't understanding. I was like, I found myself there, right? Where I'm not a racist. Like that was my, like I've never done anything like that. And immediately my answer was, one of my best friends from forever. It's a very tall, handsome, Black Ecuadorian guy. He's from Ecuador, right? So I'm like, it's not in me. My uncle, my aunt, like I immediately started looking for ways to kind of like just make sure that I wasn't racist. But then as I was learning more and I continue to learn more and I hear about systematic and I hear about, stories like what you just said, right? I was not aware of that. I was just simply not aware of that. And because it was not part of my reality, I did not realize that by accepting the reality as it is, I was being part of the problem.
Right. And I'll tell you, Cris, I mean, I don't know you personally. You seem like a lovely person. And I think a lot of times, like you said, like you're not doing anything intentional, or you don't think you're doing anything intentional to hurt other people. But I think there has been, and this is not a conspiracy theory, there are facts to back this up. I think there's been a bit of a conspiracy in history books to make us believe that racism's over, everybody's treated fairly. That sort of just world hypothesis that, if we're, Juli and I are both working on a project or we're working in an area and someone says, I need to see your receipt, I need to see documentation, Kellie, that you were here, and they don't do that to Juli, that it must mean that I'm just a bad person, right? And so when we're not telling the full truth of history, when we're not exposing the sort of the roots of racism that still exists in our society, it's entirely possible for a person to say, well, I mean, but I don't say the N-word, and I have Black friends, and I'm kind to them, and their kids come over and play with my kids, and so there's nothing I could be doing to, you know, to be complicit or to be working, you know, working in concert with racism. But okay, so I don't know how deep you all want to go into this, but I know there have been some things that have come up recently with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when Black Lives Matter was first started, people, and it still happens today, the folks involved in the movement and folks who supported it would say Black Lives Matter, and people would say, no, all lives matter. And they're correct, all lives do matter. But at this point, there's a different way that Black life is treated. So regardless of whether you're male, female, gay, straight, trans, cisgender, if you're African American, there are going to be some things that look a little different in your environment. And so I've had folks say to me and to other folks that, you know, I mean, what's wrong with saying all lives matter? So I have recently become a gardener. I'm taking on this as a hobby. This is part of my self-care, Juli. And so we've planted tomatoes, squash, a couple of different types of herbs, some melons. So if there's something going on with my tomato plants, like there's some kind of fungus or something growing on them, I need to go out and treat the tomato plants. If all the rest of the plants are doing okay, yes, all plants matter, but the tomato plants are the ones that are in need of some help. So there might be something going on with the tomato plants that's not going on with the rest. Doesn't mean that all the plants don't matter, but until I take care of the problem with the tomato plants, all my plants can't be healthy.
Thank you for clarifying that, because you know it's a hard, for somebody like me, it was hard to understand what you just explained so beautifully, right? That but everybody matters, right? But everybody has a place and everybody's important. And it was like, yes, but when you go out, you don't feel threatened.
Yeah.
When you go out, you're not in danger, you know, just because of the way that you look. So that's where the distinction comes, and that was for me was eye-opening once I finally understood. And I thank you for helping just really highlight that and maybe help somebody else understand, like I had to understand, you know, why is important that we focus on that right now, because as you said, until everybody feels safe and everybody's treated equally, then we can't just we continue to walk as nothing, and if everything is okay.
Absolutely. And Cris, I'll tell you, there's another example that people have been using about a house on fire. So if your house is on fire and the fire department comes and one of your neighbors says, but all houses matter. Yes, but mine is on fire. So which one gets water sprayed on it first? Right. And I think, again, like, so when you have this education system that tries to hide racism, make it seem like people who were enslaved were happy, they were well clothed, which is so far from the truth, right? That, you know, they were given jobs to do. Well, that's not quite how jobs work. Usually we apply for them, we interview for them, we are hired. We may have some choices in how we do our job. We can have conversations with our supervisor when things are not going well. That's not how it worked for enslaved people. And so I think once we start exposing that truth and telling history from multiple perspectives, particularly from the perspectives of those people who may have been oppressed or may have been excluded from history, then we start to be able to expose some of the little hidden corners of racism. And I think sometimes people, once they see it, they can see where it continues.
So Kelly, I want us to go and explore some of the, you know, we've explored some of the, I think the things that are on media, the things that we're all seeing, right? But there's other things that are not necessarily being explored or explained so deeply, like the concept of the in group and the out group. I want you to take us there. I want you to help us understand what that means.
Okay. So, I'm going to step a little bit away from race, and maybe I'm a gardener. Are you all gardeners? You garden a little bit? You, Cris, kind of. Juli? Yeah. Okay. So let's say we have gardeners and plant owners, people who farm, and then you have people who don't. Um, when I look at and I'm in some Facebook groups for gardening and stuff, and so when I see people do even peculiar gardening type things, they spray stuff that stinks on their plants, and they like to put their hands in the dirt and all this other stuff. I look at them and go, I understand that. That makes complete sense. And often, even when they do strange things, or sometimes when they do things that are offensive, because they're part of my group, my in-group, I understand. And I might even give them a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt, right? So, this person goes and picks some flower or sprays some weird stuff all over their flowers, even though it's probably poisonous. I still might understand because I garden too, right? But people who don't garden might look at us, they would be our out group, we would be their out group, and they might look at us and go, they're weird. They're some real strange people, right? And they might even start to develop some interesting beliefs or stereotypes about us. Like everybody who gardens looks a certain way. They all have dirt under their fingernails. They all live on farms. All of them are obsessed with their plants, and they do nothing but talk about plants. They buy nothing but plant food and root stimulator and plant tools and gloves and all these other things, which may or may not be true. I mean, I spend money on other stuff too, like way too many t-shirts and jewelry and makeup. And so because of our group membership, we may start to look at people in our group as they belong to us. We like them, we understand them, we might even make allowances for their behavior. And people who don't belong in our group, or people who we don't see as belonging, we might look at them as outsiders. They're weird, they're strange. In some cases, we might even look at them as dangerous. So let's say, Cris, you are not a gardener, and maybe I've seen you kill bees, right? So maybe you have a huge like hornet nest or something like that, or beehive near your house, and maybe it's been stinging your children, or it's causing some other type of problem in your house, but all I've ever seen you do is kill the bees. Well, I'm a gardener. I know bees as pollinators. Bees are helpful to me. They're not helpful to you. They're dangerous to you. But I'm looking at your behavior and I'm going to say, man, she's awful. Terrible person. Look at what she's doing to the bees. That is just horrendous. Although I don't know you, I have not had experiences with you. Like there's not enough information that I have there. But a lot of times we'll take our in-group and say, well, I understand them, even if they do weird and peculiar stuff. And people in our out group, we don't necessarily give them, again, the benefit of the doubt. Is that good?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that brings us actually, to some words that I think we all hear and we all use, right? Like prejudice and discrimination and racism. But I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that we always truly understand, what those words really mean and how they affect and they skew our perception and
Mm-hmm.
how we react and act with other people. So let's start unpacking them a little bit. Let's start with prejudice.
So you're absolutely right. We do tend to throw those words around a bit and not necessarily the right way. So prejudice would be negative attitudes and feelings toward other people because of their group membership. So something's wrong with Cris because she doesn't garden, right? Something's wrong with these people because they don't eat gluten. Something's wrong with these people because they eat meat, right? I probably don't know anything about them. I don't know their choices. I don't know. Maybe they have some situation that causes them to not eat gluten. Maybe it's something health related, but I don't know enough about them to even to have even had a conversation, or to have a full complement of information to make my decision. You'll sometimes hear people, sort of like there's sometimes prejudice against older people. Ugh, gosh, the older people. Like we, on occasion, will look at my dad or my mom and go, oh, are they gonna really be able to do this? I don't know. We shouldn't even introduce this. Meanwhile, my dad is like running down the information superhighway and, in the best sneakers possible. I'm going to toss another term in there, stereotype. So specific belief or assumption about an individual or a group of people based on their group membership. Some stereotypes are positive. So women tend to be more organized than men. Women tend to keep their homes cleaner than men, right? That Asian people, and these are all stereotypes, that Asian people are good at math, right? That, I don't know, all Black women can sing, right? And sing well. But a lot of stereotypes are negative. So some of the older ones, some of the ones from slavery, Black people are lazy. They're not very smart. And so, like, even if we just unpack the Black people are not smart. So there were laws back when people were enslaved that said that it was illegal for you to teach an enslaved person to read or write. And so you put folks in a situation where they're starting well behind the start line. And then you look at them 20 years later, 30 years later, even 100 years later, and say, well, what's wrong with you that you've not read the classic literature? Well, aside from the fact that, 100 years ago it was illegal for people who look like me to read, how about we might not have had access to the types of books that, so there's always, I think there's always a little bit of a grain of truth in a stereotype, but we always have to work to unpack it a bit, and also think about, like, why do we believe that, and the potential impact of it.
Right. And you said that but why is there that stereotype, right? Is like, I mean, there's a clear explanation. If you look at the root of it, maybe instead of looking at the stereotype, we should look at where it comes from and the root of it, and how can we get rid of it? How can we change it? I do want to ask still a question around stereotypes and prejudice. Is there, you talked about the positive ones, and you said, for instance, all Black women sing very well. Is that truly positive, or are there still negative connotations with all sorts of stereotypes?
I think there could still be negative connotations there. I mean, imagine if you are and I'm not saying every Black woman sings well. There happen to be some, but not all. What happens if you are the Black woman who hears Black women sing well, and you're required to take a chorus class or choir class or something like that for school, and then the teacher says, okay, I need you to sing this note or this, this measure, these bars, and you're not prepared for it. You're not wired that way. That's not your thing. You can actually experience even more negative performance than you typically would, or if you would perform average, or like in an average way. The thought of that stereotype or the threat of that stereotype might make your performance worse. And so there's actually a term, Claude Steele coined it. It's called stereotype threat. So if we remind people of those stereotypes, so you're African American, we don't expect you to do well in this class, and then we ask them to do an academic task, guess what happens? You play to the stereotype, and you're not even doing it intentionally. Right. So stereotypes, in our household, our kids will sometimes, and I'll tell you all, I'm a work in progress. I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a part of my work for Anne Arundel. But this is not work that's done in one shot. It's not a 60-day plan to being an anti-racist and you never engage stereotypes again. So occasionally my kids who are 9 and 11, they'll call me or my husband on a stereotype, right? Isn't that a stereotype? My 11-year-old is great at that. And when she hears the recording of this, she'll be like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. She said something about me. But yeah, so, and sometimes sometimes we pick up stereotypes kind of, I don't know, like we pick them up from the environment, but we don't necessarily know where they came from. There's a book by, I think her name is Jennifer Eberly. She's a social psychologist from Stanford. She wrote this book called Biased, where she does absolutely amazing work. She works with police forces. Can't talk today, with law enforcement officers, trying to help them to address unconscious bias. She really digs into a lot of these big data sets that help us to see where bias, racism, and discrimination happen. She said that there's an example of her son, who I think they were flying on an airplane for the first time, and the pilot was Black, and her son was like, I hope this works out okay. And her son is African American, with an African American father who's a positive role model. And she was like, where did he get that from, that things might not work out well because we have a pilot, like our Black pilot might be incompetent? And so I think because we're all raised in the racist smog, or we're all raised in the racist water, we pick up those stereotypes sometimes unconsciously.
And it's really interesting. Something like all Colombians know how to dance is one of the things, right? And one stereotype, and they don't seem negative. They don't seem threatening or anything like that. But when you think about it, we're setting expectations already in our minds of how somebody should behave, or how somebody is going to be or is going to act and react. And it's I love that you mentioned your child being able to recognize that and break it, because I think we all need to develop that ability to recognize when we're looking at things through that stereotype lens, and really just break that and walk away from it, understanding that that's just already tying us to a reality that is not necessarily the truth that we're seeing.
And Cris, I'll tell you, I'll tell you, there's a book out now called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And he and several other folks are sort of riffing on this idea that came from Angela Davis, who was a 1970s activist. And she said, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but the spirit of it is that, we think there are two options, being racist or non-racist, but really the opposite of racist or being racist is being anti-racist. And so Ibram Kendi's book and some of these other really great books, Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility and what does it mean to be white, Ifeoma Oluwa's book, So You Want to Talk About Race. One of the things that they talk about is that, this is a constant process. You can't, it's constant, and you will often catch yourself like, I just say, was that right? Oh, that. And even Black people, raised in the United States, or sometimes in other countries, sometimes even we pick up on some of those ideas, and we will use them to discriminate against other folks. So you'll sometimes hear, and I don't want to go too deep, because I know we got a lot of terms to cover, but sometimes you'll hear about something called colorism. And so one of the sort of foundations of racism as it's seeped into the Black community is that we sometimes will look at, and Black folks come in a wide variety of colors, right? Color, shape, sizes, hair textures, features, everything. And we'll sometimes look at people who have lighter skin and put them on a pedestal, or make it so that they are more passable, more acceptable, they're more palatable than others. And so sometimes you'll hear some criticism of Barack Obama that, that he was, he's biracial. and he was more acceptable because he had lighter skin, because because of his diction, because of the way he presented himself, where other folks might, maybe a darker skinned person or a person who maybe wasn't as refined as he was, might not have been as palatable or acceptable as the first Black president.
That's a concept that I actually am a little familiar with. I had the opportunity to create a video when I was in Towson, and it was an adopted Black teenager, I guess, at that time, and his dad was white, and he told us the stories of how he was too white, or he acted too white for his color. And I thought, well, then what does that mean, and why are there these expectations on you to act in which way? What is white? What does it mean to act white, and what does it mean to act Black? And how does that come in this conversation of racism?
So there's still that sense, and it was planted again 1619 in the othering of Black people, that things that are inherently Black or things that we've come to accept as part of the Black community are unacceptable. And so you'll sometimes hear people talk about anti-Blackness. So when I've done this before on social media, and if any of the viewers or your listeners want to try this, if you go on Google and type in professional hairstyles women, and look at the images, look at the results that come up. And what comes up is not a whole lot of people who look like me. And so what some folks have learned by sort of centering hairstyles and hair textures and the hairdos that are more common among white people or white presenting people is that hair that looks like mine is unacceptable. So I was telling my dad, I went to see him almost 2 weeks ago, and I was telling him that, even though I grew up in this great Black household with these wonderful Black parents, one of the ways that racism and colorism and all that stuff sort of seeped into me was, for a very long time, I did not believe that it was acceptable to wear my hair in its natural state, to go to a job interview, to wear to certain work functions, to wear, if I went out and I got dressed up, this was dressy hair, this was not dressy hair. And the dressy hair was the straighter hair, was the hair that looked like it was finer textured. It was styled in certain ways that actually made me look more like, sort of centered whiteness. And so that's only one example. There are a whole lot of other ways that, that there's this sort of anti-Black sentiment. And so for some Black folks, like they're teaching their kids that there's a certain way that you have to speak in interviews. There's a certain way that you speak at work, and maybe a different way that you might speak when you're around your peers. And so I don't know if you all have heard of the term code switching, but okay, so code switching is, and I'm telling all the secrets today, huh? So code switching is how those of us who occupy, a marginalized identity. So Black folks, to some extent, some Latino, Latinx folks, sometimes even folks who are gay, lesbian, folks who are transgender. This is how we are able to remain authentic to our community, but also to be able to show up in a way that's acceptable to the majority culture. So there are certain words, certain things that I might say around my family or my friends that would be acceptable around them, but they might not be acceptable when I'm in a job interview. So when I'm talking to my husband or talking to my kids and I think something's really great, for example, I might say, "Oh, that's lit." Or I might say to my friends, "Oh, that's lit." I would not say that in a job interview. I'd be a surefire way for me, for folks to sort of give the signal to each other that she's not the one. For like folks who are gay, they'll sometimes talk about how they act in a way that's more sort of straight presenting or heterosexual presenting, so that they don't let on that they're gay because they don't want to face the discrimination that might happen if someone finds out that they're gay. So it's illegal at the federal level to discriminate in a job, in an employment setting against someone because of their sexual orientation or their race. There's some other gender. There's some other protected categories. But if I don't say it out loud, so I don't say, nah, I'm not interested in so-and-so because she's Black, there might be other ways that I can figure out how to make that decision or to exclude that person without saying it out loud.
The conversation is going in so many different ways, different than what we had originally planned, and I'm about to take it there again. And I hope you're okay with this, because you mentioned something that it's kind of trending, I think, right now, and it's one of those things that it's important. You said that we think of racism as being either I'm a racist or I am not a racist, and right now we're exploring the idea of anti-racism. Can we go there? Can we explain what that really means and why we want to be anti-racist, not just say I am not a racist?
Okay, so, and I think that this kind of gets at the idea or the ideas of overt versus covert racism. So overt racism, when we think about racism, and I'll pitch it back to you and Juli, when I say racism, what do you think of? Kind of outward examples of racism.
Sure. So, I mean, glaring example would be the KKK, right? And any sort of discriminate. I mean, we just talked about professionalism, like not hiring someone because of their race, maybe passing opportunities to other people because of their race, racial slurs, having those prejudice beliefs, but like really loud, you're telling people about them. And I'm sure everybody listening has seen this on Facebook as well. It's really shocking to see what's popping out of people you thought you knew. And it's because we've been keeping stuff down, that we haven't been having conversations like this, that a lot of racism has kind of become a little bit more covert. Of course, there's still the glaring racism. There was something in Ohio recently. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off the track.
So Juli's given us some great examples of covert racism. Overt racism. It's just out there. If someone were to walk in the room right now and refer to me by the N-word, you would know that's racism. But there are some other ways that racism can show up, and we might not necessarily be aware of it. In some other ways, we might even support that. Like sometimes when we hear about like the war on drugs, or some of the like federal legislation about crime, right? So controlling crime. So no one wants to live in a dangerous neighborhood. I mean, okay, maybe some folks are into that, but for the most part, most folks don't want to live in a dangerous neighborhood. If you were to say to me, hey, Kelly, we're going to do this thing where we make sure that there are more police driving around in your neighborhood, so that if we see crime, we can address it, and we can address it quickly. Then, knowing nothing else about the neighborhood, all things being equal, I'd probably be like, yeah, sounds like it might not be a terrible idea. But if those police officers also have an idea of what someone who commits a crime looks like, so and so fits the description, then that means that in certain neighborhoods, let's say a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of racial variation. Maybe there are a couple of Black families in a neighborhood or development with 45 houses. That Black family might be targeted a little more often if the officers think, oh, fits the description. And this does happen. It does happen. And so that would be an example of more covert racism, right? And even if you ask the police officers, hey, did you target him because he's Black? They probably just say he fits the description, right? Another good example might be healthcare. So all of us want to be healthy, I'm gonna guess. I mean, some of us might not care, but all of us want to do some stuff to make sure that we stay healthy and maybe live longer. So what happens, and there's a whole lot of really interesting literature about health disparities based on race. One of them that's recently come up is that there are a lot of doctors who have unconscious bias. So they hold some biases or some ideas about African American people that end up affecting the way that they treat them. So that there's some research that suggests that some doctors are less likely to offer pain medicine to African American clients, and this happens with birth. It happens with just general pain management, because the thought is that African American clients can just endure more pain. Yeah, take a deep breath. I don't know if you all heard about Serena Williams when she gave birth to her daughter. So she had a C-section. Serena Williams has a history of blood clots, right? This has affected her for years. So she had her daughter by C-section. She could tell by the way her body felt that something was off. And she thought she was feeling like, it feels like there might be a blood clot. So she talked to the physicians, or talked to the medical staff, and they said, no, you're fine. And she told them exactly what she needed. So this is the type of workup that you need, that I need right now. And they were content to tell her, no, you don't need that. Turns out, after the C-section, she had a blood clot. So she knew exactly what was going on, but folks weren't paying attention to her. I sometimes wonder, because she had money, did she get more attention than another African American woman might have gotten in a similar situation? So if you asked her doctors, are you racist? Like, come on now, she's Black. Did you do this because she's Black? You asked the nurses, they would have said, no, of course not. But there may be that sort of sneaking suspicion that Black folks can endure more pain, and so we just won't offer them more pain medicine, or that they're seeking that they're more likely to be drug dealers or drug addicts, and so we're not going to give them the medication that they might be asking for, because Black people are more likely to sell drugs or to use drugs, and that's a lie. The rates of drug use are, some folks will tell you that they're equal, and some will actually say that white folks are using drugs more than Black people. So does that help?
Yeah, so, but I think, so to be an anti-racist, does it mean that we are just aware of this and so that we are not making those decisions because of the color? So I guess I'm really trying to understand, what it really means to be an anti-racist, and how do we put it in motion? How do we act to be an anti-racist?
So to be anti-racist, one means that you have to acknowledge that you hold some racist views. It doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. So Robin DiAngelo's great sociologist and scholar on whiteness, she talks about how some folks think of racism as a good-bad binary. So if you're racist, you're bad. If you're not racist, you're good, right? But that's all a fallacy, because we can do things that sort of foster the system and still be really good people. Like I can have Black friends, I can invite their kids over to play with my kids, and I can still do stuff that's complicit with racism. So just acknowledging that there are going to be some things that I need to be continually working through with myself. To be a person who decides that instead of just accepting history or accepting messages as they are, I want to know the context. So when you say to me, I don't believe Black people are as smart, I want to know more about that. So, like, what makes you think that? And what kinds of things might have happened in history to make us believe that? It's looking at policies and making sure that those policies and those laws and those decisions are not impacting certain groups of people, certain racial groups, more so than they impact others. And so, like when we look at policing, when we look at housing, right? So I know you all have done or are doing a show on redlining, and so redlining, not to give away the whole story, but redlining was a policy that was used to keep African Americans from being able to get housing loans, right? So certain areas, banks would say we're not going to loan to folks who live in those areas. And it wasn't, I'm not going to loan to Black, like they didn't say I'm not going to loan to Black people. They just marked out the areas on the map where the Black people lived and said, we're not giving you loans there. And so when you say there's a big wealth gap between white people and Black people in the United States, you can't just accept that or look at Black people and say, well, what's wrong with you all? You have to dig deeper and say what policies were sort of the building blocks of those discrepancies. So what is it? There's this great video that went viral. This woman, I can't remember her name. She used the metaphor of monopoly to talk about racism, and she said, it's as if Black folks have been playing Monopoly for 400 years, but they were never able to buy any property, make any money, or keep their money. Right? Every time they got a little something, somebody would take it away. And so then emancipation happens, and okay, now you all can garner some stuff. Like you can get some property, you can start working. But then Jim Crow laws come along and they take everything away again. And so again, when we look at the wealth gap, we've got to look at the underlying causes. When we look at the issues with law enforcement, we have to go all the way back to like the black codes and vagrancy laws and things like that. So we tell folks, okay, you're emancipated. You are now free. They have nowhere to live. They have no jobs. And so, and there's still crops that need to be harvested. And so we set up a system that says, okay, if you are gathering and if you don't have a home, right? Or if you don't have somewhere to go and you're just hanging around, we're going to round you up and take you back to do hard labor. And all of that, yes, I know there have been some great examples of Black people who have done well and have been exemplars in their field and have maybe even done well financially. Madam C.J. Walker, great example, first African-American millionaire, African-American female millionaire, self-made. And there have been other wealthy Black people, but if you look at the numbers and you look at sort of the head start that wealthy white people have had, you can see that if we try to make an apples to apples comparison of wealth gaps, or if we look at the wealth gap and go apples to apples, then we really have to think about what's behind that. It's being anti-racist is the recognition that regardless of what other groups people belong to, so whether you're a Black man, a Black woman, Black trans woman, Black gay person, that your life matters too, right? And so it's also kind of digging into some of those intersections where people live. And like I told you, I'm a Black woman, so I'm affected potentially by discrimination against Blacks, but also potentially discrimination against women, and sometimes doubly or triply penalized because I'm affected by discrimination that affects Black women, right? And so it's recognizing those forces also, and just knowing, again, it's a constant struggle.
You know, I thank you for that answer, because I love what you said. You said, you know, we are in a society that has kind of like programmed us to act certain way, and we just need to recognize that we might be doing and we might be acting in ways that are perpetuating racism, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person, because I think that that's part
Yeah.
of the reason why a lot of people don't speak up, because they think that, well, if I say that I've been doing this, you know, that falls into, you know, being a racist. I wasn't doing it with that purpose, but now I'm going to be categorized as a bad person. I don't want to be,
Yeah.
you know, put in that group. And so I think that understanding that, you know, we've been conditioned, and
Yeah.
just not knowingly, really,
Yeah.
because we were not thinking about those things. It's
Yep.
important so that we can open up, you know, become vulnerable, be honest in the conversation,
Mhm.
really understand where everybody is, and come together in a place that's safe for
Yeah.
everyone.
And Chris, I'll also say, I think if you're looking to be anti-racist, you also have to be humble enough to accept criticism, right? So somebody is going to call you on your racism, right? They're going to say, "Ugh, that sounded kind of racist," or, "Gosh, that's a stereotype. Ouch, that stereotype really hurts." Or, what made you think that about, like, when you say stuff like that, it like you're saying that about people who look like me. Oh, I didn't mean it. So instead of getting defensive about it, just recognizing we are all gonna step in it, right? We're all gonna say things that that don't quite work out the way that that we mean to say them. If you ever want to test that, and I don't know how many of your listeners are parents, but when you're a parent, your kid comes into the world, you have all these great ideas for what you're going to do, what you're going to say, and how you're going to raise them. And at some point, you're going to step in it, right? So you're going to raise your voice. You're going to, you're going to make a food choice that's not okay, or your kid's going to tell you their stomach hurts, and you're going to go, no worries, just go to bed, you'll be okay. And then the kid ends up vomiting everywhere. You're like, oh, no. You have to be willing to accept that along this journey, you're going to make some mistakes. It's all part of the journey. The other part of one of the other parts of being anti-racist is going out and educating yourself, and not necessarily expecting that the people you've discriminated against are going to be the ones to educate you. So so that we all have the Google, right? We can all Google the New York Times bestseller list, right? And pick books from those lists that that teach us more about anti-racism. We don't necessarily have to gather a group of our 6 to 10 or however many Black friends and say, please tell me what to do, right? And so that, I think that's another part of anti-racism, just recognizing that you're continually on an education journey. You gotta be humble, and you have to be willing to do a little deeper processing with stuff.
I'm going to quickly
Absolutely.
plug a couple of educational resources. So one, of course, please tune in to our podcast series that we're doing, because we have a lot
Absolutely.
of wonderful guest experts coming in, including Dr. McCants-Price. And they're going to be talking about some of these different aspects that maybe you haven't thought about before. The other thing is, if you're not a big reader, which I know that some people get alarmed by having to read a whole book, which I hope that you don't, but if you do, there are tons of TED Talks by these folks that Kelly has been mentioning, like Ibram X. Kendi, I believe Robin DiAngelo, who is a white woman, but she talks about white fragility. I know that like Layla F. Saad, and there's so much out there. Literally, you can Google how to be an anti-racist and stuff will pop up for you to start consuming. And if you're stuck, we will be including a list at the bottom of our podcast descriptions that have anti-racist resources that are like a compilation of articles, books, podcasts, videos, movies, documentaries, all that stuff as well. So we're going to give you a little bit, although I encourage you to Google, because that is part of the work, is owning what you've done and that you need help and you need to find it. And just like Kelly said, it is not your Black friends' responsibilities to be educating you. that is more emotional labor. We'll unpack that in some of our episodes. But really, like, truly Google stuff. I promise you, as an educator, when I don't know the question, like, I go and I Google stuff. That is okay.
Me too.
Not to know the answer.
So, and of course now I'm going to be the Black friend who's educating you, but I'm an educator. So there are a couple of amazing films. So again, for the folks who are like, yeah, no, I don't know about the books. Some of the books are on Audible or other like streaming services where you can just listen to the book, listen to the author read the book. So 13th is a phenomenal documentary on Netflix. It was created by Ava DuVernay, the woman who's behind the film Selma. And I'm trying to remember. Now I'm blanking on my and When They See Us. But she does this wonderful job of sort of tracing the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that abolished slavery. But there's a catch. And the catch is that slavery is abolished unless you are a prisoner. So once you get into the criminal justice system, all the rules change. And what she does is she traces from the institution of the 13th Amendment all the way up through present times to show what has happened to incarcerated populations. And so how the populations have changed, the kinds of sort of subversive kinds of things that were done legally to make it so that incarceration was something that became more welcome. I hate to even use those, incarceration and welcome, together in a sentence, but it's the truth. So that's really awesome. If you haven't seen the movie Just Mercy, that, I don't know if it's still available for free, but I know at one point Amazon and several other streaming services were offering that. But that stars Jamie Foxx and oh my gosh, I am totally blanking on his name. Killmonger from Black Panther. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna lose my black card for this one. Michael B.
Jordan.
Okay, so Michael B. Jordan plays Brian Stevenson, who is a civil rights attorney, who worked for a very long time on death row cases in Alabama. So phenomenal film. Another great book, and if you're like a real social scientist or a medical nerd, kind of like I am, there's a book called Dying of Whiteness. It's by a psychiatrist named Jonathan Metzl, Metzl. And what he does in this book it's a really fascinating read. I listened to it on Audible, so no shame, for the folks who are audiobook people. What he does is he takes a few different sort of social institutions, like the Affordable Care Act, education, gun control, and those kinds of things. And he looks at different states and compares how two different states handled them. And he goes and he looks at the sort of racist underpinnings for some of the social decisions, or some of the policy and social decisions that we make in this country. So again, absolutely fascinating. And I saw him, he gave a talk for one of the like social justice agencies once, and I saw him give this talk, and I was still wig blown back. This is fascinating stuff. And if you're a social science person, he does some really interesting social science research to figure out how to, sort of get at the underlying race piece. But it's also readable, right? Ezra Klein has another book. Let's see, there I go with my books. So Ezra Klein is a journalist, has been on some of the TV networks, and he has a book called, I think it's called Why We're Divided. And it looks at political parties. So if you're not a politics person, don't read this one. Or maybe read it. Maybe it'll make you a politics person. But he looks at what has happened in, say, the last 50 years or so that's actually caused political divides, and racism is one of the things that comes into the story. Hillbilly Elegy is another good one.
You
Do
can
I
give the
sound like
whole
an
list.
academic? I kind of do. Yeah, J.D. Vance, he's an attorney, but he writes this story about growing up in Appalachia. And the book is awesome, and it eventually gets to like why there are folks who you would think it would be in their best interest to vote in a certain way, but they vote in a different way, and there are some racist underpinnings there too. So some covert racism that comes out in many of those books.
And thank you for all of those resources, and thank you for making us work to understand this, and understanding that we need to be respectful, and we need to be mindful of our friends of color who are experiencing this in a very internal way, and that I thank you so much for being open to coming and having this conversation. But I understand that here's a Latina who really I've always been said, you live in a world of unicorns where you think that everybody is fine and everybody's good, and and that's always been me. Like, I've always seen the good in people, and maybe that's why I was not aware of the racism that I'm sure happened in my country, right? And Juli is a white female, and that's the lens that she comes from, and we really, really appreciate that you are sitting here and having this open and honest conversation with us, as we understand that it is not your job to educate us, but it is part of opening the conversation, and making this platform useful, so that people will hopefully then go and read those books, and listen to those, watch those movies, listen to podcasts, and just really expand their horizon, and really, really try to understand racism for what it really is, and how we can change it, and hopefully really eradicate it from our system, and start a fair place for everybody. And speaking of that, systematic racism, that's another term that I think, at least for me, I only started hearing it in the last few months. It's not something that I had been exposed to. I had been exposed to racism, the term, and discrimination and prejudice, and stereotypes and all of that. But systematic racism was something that I needed to go and figure out what it was, and what people were referring to and talking about. So can we dive a little bit into what that really is, and why we need to look at it, and why we need to understand that in this process of social justice and changing that we're going through right now?
Yeah. So, Cris, we tend to think of racism as an individual thing, right? So this person said or called me the N-word. They're racist, right? This hiring manager wouldn't hire me. They are racist. And I think when we look at it that way, it's really easy to say, yeah, it's kind of over. Y'all kind of need to get over it. But when we go and we take a much deeper look at systemic racism, or sometimes you'll hear people call it institutional racism, what we find is that in some of the very policies that we expect to keep us safe, to keep our nation in order, there's racism invested there too. So, and I pulled some statistics because I knew you were going to ask me about this. So African Americans have double the likelihood of being unemployed than white people. And so for those people who look at racism as sort of an individual thing, it's one thing if Kellie is unemployed, right? And you can say, well, maybe it was the hair, maybe it was something you said, maybe you said lit in the interview, maybe that was a problem, right? But when we look across a population and see that Black folks make up about 13% of the population in the United States, but we're twice as likely to be unemployed. There's something invested in the system, or something in the water, that's causing an issue. Probably one of the more, and you can find a lot of this stuff for those of you who are interested in digging more into this. There's a group called Race Forward. So if you just Google them, they have these really short videos, like 2-minute videos about systemic or institutional racism. White people are 77% of the population. They have 90% of the wealth in the country. Black people are 13%. They have 26% of the wealth. Right? There shouldn't be that big of a difference? Okay, all right. In education, Black children make up about 18% of the preschool population, but they make up about 50% of all suspensions. So again, if Kellie as an individual was going in at 4 years old and punching people, then there should be some consequence for me, right? But what is it? What's happening in a system where you're less than 1/5 of the population and you make up half of the suspensions? So one narrative could be that, something's wrong with Black children. And sometimes that narrative is played out as, well, it's because the fathers aren't in the family and because, like they grew up in chaotic situations and because of this and that. When in actuality, Black fathers are quite involved with their children, probably more so than we can even imagine. But there's something going on. And there have been some studies where like vignettes about kids have been given out to teachers, and the teachers have been told to assess either blame or, morality or whatever of the kids. And it always ends up that, the Black kids end up looking like they're more problematic, or teachers are told to observe a room of students and tell us which ones are engaging in problematic behavior. None of them are, right? That's the catch, right? There's no problematic behavior going on at all, but the Black children are assigned to the group of problematic children, right? I pulled a whole bunch of them for you. Even things like racist mascots, that's part of systemic racism. So we sometimes think that when we're honoring Native Americans, right, or indigenous people, that one way to honor them is to have their face on some helmet, jerseys, on painted on the field of whatever our favorite sports team is. But if they're painted as a caricature, if they're named with a derogatory slur, that's racist, right? And for as much as we love our sports teams, I know, I love some sports teams too. But if the mascot is racist, let's figure out ways to make that go away, right? We can still love the team, but we can use a mascot that is better at honoring who the team is. Let's see what else. Oh, here's another one, the Canon of Literature. And while this may not be like systemic or institutional at a law level or a legal level, when we talk about like what books should people have read by the time they're, say, 25? And look at who the authors are. They're usually straight, white, old men, right? Women get left out of the picture. People of color get left out of the picture. People who are in the LGBTQ community get left out of the picture, right? So, so those are some examples. We've talked about some other ones, discriminatory lending practices, so or even predatory lending practices. So we know that we're going to end that the interest rates on these loans are going to go like this, and so instead of targeting white people, we target Black people.
Yeah. So to really quickly summarize all of that beautiful information, systematic racism is basically that the system was built to support or benefit the white male, typically older white male, right? And that we have to recognize the system is inherently racist in its practices, not necessarily as overt as we don't like Black people, but it shows up in stuff like the education materials that you're exposed to, or like textbooks. For instance, Juneteenth, I didn't learn about that till maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And now everybody out here is like, "Ooh, it's a federal holiday," and
even the NFL, Juli, even the NFL, and Starbucks too.
Yeah. And it shows up in so many different ways, and it's really interesting to see. Myself included, how much we just kind of operate, especially if you're benefiting from the system. You don't take time to maybe sit and think and go, and I don't know if this is fair. And it's also deeply uncomfortable to say, and I've been benefiting from this.
Right.
I don't want to give up my privilege because I like having privilege and all of the things that come with it, but I'm inherently hurting my peers if this continues.
Right.
And that's really what the vibe is.
And so, Julie, I think sometimes when we talk about race, because people sort of whisper about race, and there are some folks who believe that it's impolite to talk about race, we don't move forward unless we have the conversations. But let's say we talk about ability first, right? So if you're an able-bodied person, there are certain things in this world that you might never really need, or you might not need too much, like ramps, right? Maybe you'll need an elevator every once in a while, but most of your days you could probably get away without one. Captions on your TV, you might not necessarily need, braille and those kinds of things. And so I think for some folks, it's easier to start, from the position of like, I have privilege because I'm able-bodied. And then when I insist that, no, we don't need an elevator in this building, I don't necessarily think about how I might be benefiting and how somebody else might be harmed or hurt in the process. And then the statements that we make about folks. So let's say someone is in a wheelchair and they need the elevator to get up to the third or fourth floor of the building, and they're a student in one of our classes. What might we say? What stereotypes might we have? What prejudices? And then in what ways might we discriminate against somebody who's constantly showing up late, or they don't show up at all because they can't make it up to the fourth floor in a wheelchair?
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think there's just race just makes everybody kind of panic a little bit. Everything that's going on, and everything that has been going on, and maybe the lack of education that we have experienced and everything. And it feels really uncomfortable to acknowledge that you are part of the system and perpetuating it if you're not going against it. So I think, we're we're well over our planned time. I want to take maybe 5 minutes and just talk about, and I think it makes sense, but let's really hammer it home, how racism, whether systematic, whether intergenerational, whether whatever we're calling it, covert, overt, how that impacts mental wellness or mental health of Black people specifically, since that's what we're talking about, but people of color overall.
So I think on some level you get used to certain things that you have to do, like some certain code switching that you have to do in this world. But I think there's also that certain, like, I'm married to a Black man. I get nervous when he doesn't come home at a certain time. And I'm not worried about who he's out with, but I sometimes am concerned that he could be pulled over by a police officer because he fits the description. And so there's that sort of low level apprehension that runs for me. It's sort of running in the background for me. There's also, just the negative feelings that you deal with when, in the social media age, you're finding out live on Facebook or Instagram or wherever that friends of yours express racist views or don't acknowledge your humanity. So I've dealt with some folks who've said, well, we can just agree to disagree. Well, racism, heteros, and homophobia and transphobia, we can't just agree to disagree, because that affects how you see my humanity and other people's humanity. And so there's that. There are people who have lost jobs or who are losing jobs because they've aligned themselves with a movement like Black Lives Matter or other kinds of groups that are really stepping forward and trying to affect, positively affect change in this country. And so even your activism could potentially be something that ends up being weaponized against you. And so there's all of that. And if you've already got some underlying issues related to race, or issues related to mental health, then all of that can be even worse. There's also, and if I'm just perfectly honest, speaking from my own experience, seeing videos of people who look like me being murdered at the hands of whoever it is traumatizing. And so I've actually made a decision. My husband and I have talked about this. I don't watch the videos anymore. And sometimes I even turn off the news. I don't have to hear any more about it. Once I know what has happened, that's enough, right? So there's a whole lot there. There's a whole lot to unpack. And knowing that, like I kind of live with the certainty, the uncertainty about whether or not the movements that are going on now are going to make some good, significant, lasting change, and whether people who are sort of new to being anti-racist are going to continue being anti-racist. And that's also, there can also be some racial battle fatigue there. So I'm working hard, I'm trying to educate folks, I'm doing whatever I can, but then I also sometimes am a little suspicious. So, people come along and say, yes, I'm in the fight. And when it gets hard, they say, nope, I'm not in the fight.
Thanks for acknowledging that, because I am not a Black person. I am a Latina person, and I've had these conversations with my kids, and we're telling them, my son, if you're ever stopped by the police, make sure they can see your hands, make sure they can do this, make sure that, like how to act, how to behave, how to not call attention to yourself. And I'm not feeling to the point where you're feeling it, right? Because he looks white. He has green eyes. His hair is a little he is not exactly blonde, but he looks white. And I'm still having those conversations, and I'm still worried, and I'm still thinking about that. And my husband is Latino, and we have these conversations as well. And it really is affecting. And I have not been able to watch the videos. I've read, and I know all the information. I know what happened, and I can't put myself. I just can't bring myself to watch the videos. Yeah. I just can't do it. Yeah. So, somebody said, if you're tired about hearing about racism, imagine how tired we are.
401 years later. Yep.
Yeah.
And Cris, I'll tell you, I did the several organizations were doing 8-minute, 46-second moments of silence in honor of George Floyd. And I said, you know what? I really feel like I should be part of that. So I haven't watched the whole video. I don't intend to, but I'm going to be part of the moment of silence. And I think at about 3 minutes, like I was ready to start crying, like real tears, because I realized, I don't think we think in our everyday world about how long 8 minutes and 46 seconds is. You get a few minutes into it and you're like, when is this time going to be over with? And so you just have to wonder, like, what was going on? What was going through George Floyd's mind? And then like you hear that he called for his mother, and I'm a mother, right? So that's another part of my intersections. And so to think of somebody's son calling for his his deceased mom, he probably knew what was coming. He knew he was gonna be deceased, and was just calling for his mom in whatever way he could for her to come to her aid. And even that is a lot to stomach.
Absolutely. And just like that, that's just one case. We're hearing about Elijah, and we're hearing about all of these other names out there. And it has to stop. There can't be any more names. They just, we need this to stop. We need this to just go away. It needs to be a safe place for everybody. Juli, I know you always finish, and we're just about there. We only have about 5 more minutes left. Your show on a positive note, with a self-care send-off is what Juli calls it. And Kellie, if you could just finish, the show today with some words on how we can take care of ourselves, because it's a lot, and we're all processing it in the best that we can. And I think it's important to continue to have this conversation and to get comfortable with it, to really come from a good place and have this heart-to-heart conversations where we understand how we might be part of the problem, even though we might not be doing anything wrong, right? But just allowing things to continue to be the way they are. But it's a lot. It's a lot, and it affects and it hurts in so many ways, and very, very deep. And it challenges us to really look at ourselves and try to be better. So what would you say to people, you know, who are watching right now, and it's been a lot, and I forgot to give a warning at the beginning of the show today that we were going to be talking about something really, really heavy. So, you know, just to take that breather as you're processing this in your own home, at work, in society, through the media and everything else, how are you taking care of yourself, Kellie?
So I will tell you honestly, self-care has always been a struggle for me. And one of the ways that I'm taking care of myself is I'm not watching the videos. And that is a very conscious decision that I've made. I also turn off social media. So at times, you know, I'm done. The phone is over here. The computer is closed. I'm in another room, or I'm out in the garden. I'm playing with tomatoes. And so I think, you know, finding some type of healthy habit that you can get into, whether it's walking, yoga, gardening, you know, something like that, because this is heavy stuff. The fight for racial justice is not a 60-day or 30-day plan. And so if we expect to be able to stay in the fight, stay in the struggle long term, we do have to unplug. I think one other thing that's been an incredible blessing for me is building coalition with other and community building. So knowing that I'm not in this alone, finding other people who are like-minded, who, you know, who really are, and I have friends of lots of races, ethnicities, gender, sexual orientation, who are all a part of this struggle, and we're fighting for all of our common humanity. So, you know, they recognize, as do I, that the anti-racism struggle is just a part. It's a big part because it's been 401 years that we've been doing this. But to also recognize that, you know, that we're fighting together. And occasionally we need to socialize together. And I know it's challenging to do that in COVID, but, you know, the Zoom happy hours have been helpful. If you can do some social distancing, like go somewhere like a picnic or something with just a few people, and, you know, and you all kind of sit together, but 6 feet apart with a mask. You know, and enjoy some time together, enjoy some laughs together. You know, and the other thing, and I have a friend who's like he's very anti-racist, very serious about this work, and he's constantly serious. And one of the things that I have to always remind myself of is that even though we're in this, we can still laugh, right? We can still, now I'm not laughing at racism. It's not funny. But there are other ways that I can find some laughter, and that I can, you know, that I can still sort of refresh myself with things that I enjoy.
Thank you so much, Kellie, for giving us your time today, your personal experience, your educational experience, your beautiful analogies, metaphors, whatever they are. I can never tell the difference. Don't tell my grandma. She was an English teacher. She'd be
It's okay.
I thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope to have you back someday to talk a little bit more with us. And thank you for the reminder that this really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You can't like read 12 books and then be an anti-racist. It's a lifelong commitment. You need to do the work, continue to do the work, and recognize when we need a little help and assistance with others. So we are we are well over our planned hour. I don't want to keep us any longer. Thank you all so much for listening. Please tune in for the series throughout July, every Tuesday, on different special guests, different topics, and we are all wishing you good mental health.